After the flop of the first debate between Biden and Trump, the Democratic coalition, which has never been a particularly, shall we say, harmonious coalition, has been divided in a way that I haven't seen since the bad old days of the 2016 nomination. There's been a chorus of political and media figures demanding that Biden step down, others insisting that he stay in. Some insist he cannot win in November. Others insist that Democrats cannot win without him. There's a lot of sound and fury and not much light. The political media has been entirely unhelpful. During the 2 weeks of nonstop coverage of the Biden issue, I found it frustrating that while they report on every dropped hint by every Democrat of any clout, they aren't explaining the mechanics that lie at the heart of the nomination process. So a lot of people are just whirling in confusion. What does it mean that Nancy Pelosi, quote unquote, showed openness to Biden stepping down? Does that mean she'll make him step down? Is Biden compelled to heed the words of shadowy Democratic elites, whoever they are? Can an open convention work? What would trigger it? Will, quote unquote, they run Gretchen Whitmer? Who's they anyway? Is it the DNC? Will Michelle Obama save us? Can Harris be sidestepped? Can she force Biden off the ticket? I want to focus on how the process actually works. What's realistic, what's not, what we can control, and what we can just react to. In order to get my facts straight, I spoke to David Atkins. He's a longtime progressive activist and an elected member of the DNC. He got his start as a volunteer in the Howard Dean campaign back in 2004, and he's been involved in Democratic politics ever since. Whether on Twitter or on his writings in the Washington Monthly, I've always found him to be a grounded and values-driven voice, and I was very grateful for his knowledge. You'll hear my interview with him presently. I want to caution listeners that the opinions expressed here are my own, and I'm by no means suggesting that Atkins shares them. To get a dose of his own opinions directly, please follow him on Twitter, or should I say X, at David O. Atkins to hear what he has to say. You are listening to the Odd Post podcast, and I'm your host, Anila Mirchandani. Please listen, comment, and share with friends who might find some value in this discussion. Please also rate and review the Odd Post podcast. Here are some of the things I learned through my research and through speaking with Atkins. First, for people who want to replace Biden at the top of the ticket, their only shot is that Biden chooses, of his own accord, to relinquish his right to the nomination. There's no play for Democratic elites, donors, media, or anyone else to force him off the ticket because he won those delegates through the primary overwhelmingly. So the debate about whether Biden ought to step down, that horse has left the barn. He's not. Now, why do I say that? Doesn't it mean anything that donors like George Clooney write op-eds saying he'd prefer if Biden were to step down? What about all those whispered leaks from Democrats saying they're worried about his chances? What about the Bulwark crew insisting that if it would be a failure of Democratic elites if they can't get him to step down? So this is the first misconception. Election winners, primary winners, they're all independent actors. They owe nothing to anyone but their voters. That's where the mandate comes from. That's how our system works. Not only do elites not have leverage over Biden in this situation, as long as his base sticks with him, they don't even have the right to ask him to quit. Now, every once in a while, you have an Al Franken who bows to unremitting pressure from colleagues and sees himself out the door. But then you also have the Bob Menendez, who, despite more than half his caucus asking him to leave, just sticks it out until the news cycle shifts. It would be another thing if it was a Democratic chorus, but it appears that some of the most popular Democrats are sticking with Biden, including AOC, Bernie Sanders, John Fetterman, Jasmine Crockett, and the Congressional Black Caucus. Jim Clyburn of the CBC was the man most responsible for Biden being the 2020 nominee. He's the kingmaker where Biden is concerned. What about the all-powerful DNC? Can they knock Biden off the chessboard like a pawn if they so desire? The DNC acquired some powers of mythical proportions in people's minds during the 2016 nomination battle. But here's the thing. We're not in the days of yore when party bosses in smoke-filled rooms chose who to run. The way the DNC exerts control over the process is by adopting certain rules for the primaries and the nomination. Once the rules are in motion, they play out without the DNC's active interference. According to these rules, primaries are held all over the states. Candidates throw their hats into the ring. Successful incumbent presidents don't usually draw a lot of challengers, but age has always been a vulnerability for Biden, and he did draw two challengers, RFK Jr., who later quit to go run as an independent, and Dean Phillips, a successful two-term rock-ribbed Democratic congressman. Voters weren't impressed, and they picked the Biden-Harris ticket overwhelmingly. How overwhelmingly? Well, the point of the primaries is to pick pledged delegates. These are just humans who are supporters of the ticket and the party's platform. There were 3,979 pledged delegates up for grabs, and the Biden-Harris ticket won 3,904, which comes to around 98%. The runner-up, in case you're curious, it wasn't Dean Phillips or RFK Jr., it was uncommitted, with less than 1% of delegates. These delegates go off to the convention in August to actually pick the nominee. This is done in a series of votes or ballots. If a candidate wins the majority on the first round, game over, the nominee is chosen. Now, these delegates, they are pledged delegates, which means they are obliged to vote for the candidate they were pledged to. In other words, Biden. So as long as Biden is in the running, Biden will win that vote. Now, don't superdelegates get to muscle in and change the vote? No, they don't. After the fight over superdelegates in 2016, the DNC changed their rules, and now these superdelegates don't even get to vote in the first round. Okay, now that's not the full entire story because there's an out in the language of the DNC rules, the good conscience clause. Here's Atkins explaining it.
And my understanding is the pledged word indicates that they're obliged to support the candidate that they came in, correct?
Yes, they are obliged to support the candidate that they came in, but it's very important to note that in the call for the 2024 Democratic National Convention, in paragraph F2D, it says, all delegates to the National Convention pledged to a presidential candidate shall in all good conscience reflect the sentiments of those who elected them. Mm-hmm. And in this particular circumstance, that language is very important because obviously we had a Democratic primary.
Yeah.
But many states canceled their primaries. Many states didn't have primaries, so that's a challenge. And also, there may be, there's new information now that was not present. So, and if you look at polling of Democrats and all of that, there might be some significant room for interpretation in terms of good conscience of reflecting sentiments of those who elected them. So, so they are pledged. And 99.9% of the time, that would mean voting for the candidate who won your primary. Mm-hmm. But under extraordinary circumstances, they have to best interpret in their good conscience the sentiments of those who elected them.
Okay, so that's the out that people are looking at. In other words, otherwise there would be no story at all, right? Like, I mean, if they're pledged and Biden won those pledged delegates, that's the end of the matter. But it's that one in good conscience clause that gives them an out. Is that basically? Yeah.
But I think it's important that is true. I think it's important to note, though, that if Biden doesn't voluntarily withdraw, that good conscience clause is going to be difficult to interpret in any way except vote for Biden because, you were sent to the convention to do so as a Biden delegate. So I think this conversation, so while the conscience clause is interesting, I think that in reality, unless Joe Biden himself were persuaded to withdraw, that functionally speaking, Biden would win the nomination among the votes in the first ballot.
Yeah. And that was my thought too, but I wanted to explore that in good conscience clause to understand how it would play out. And so just bear with me. I was thinking one possible scenario would be if another candidate, I'm just going to throw out some names. I mean, I'm not trying to say that they're going to challenge Biden, but let's say Gavin Newsom or Pritzker or any of these people were to decide to challenge Biden, they would have to start now drumming up support amongst those pledged delegates, right? Or whatever number there are, 4,000 or whatever, 3,000, to start building a majority for them all to vote for this new person. Isn't that about right?
Yes. The chances of that happening are essentially zero. But yes, that is what they would have to do. Yes.
To clarify the stakes here, this is the scenario where Biden chooses to stay on as a candidate, but the nomination is denied to him. It would essentially be a within-party coup. Now, how would this work? For one thing, one cannot beat something with nothing. Candidates who want to pull off a within-party coup would have to start courting pledged delegates to shift allegiances to them. This is no easy task. It would involve convincing almost 2,000 party operatives that their good conscience leads them to vote in a different way than the people who sent them to Chicago obliged them to. Now, there isn't much time left until the convention, so we would be hearing about this effort by now. Challengers would have made their intention to run clear. There'd be a social media effort. It would have fed the he's running, she's running kind of speculation that is Twitter's bread and butter. We would be hearing about partisans making frantic calls to delegates to get them to switch allegiances. Tensions would be rising between the Biden camp and the challengers camp. The press would be filled with insider-driven stories, with each camp running the other down. The challenger, whoever it is, Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, Hillary Clinton, Josh Shapiro, any of the other names people have thrown out in recent days, would have to come to the fight with a knife in their teeth, ready to slash their way to the top, fighting off the partisans of the Biden camp and the Harris camp. You would have seen them hire a delegate wrangler type of campaign manager. Remember back in 2016 when Trump was expecting a floor fight at the convention, he hired Manafort. One of his specialties, aside from the Russia connection, was that he was adept at convention wrangling. What we have actually seen is crickets. Newsom has been out in the Midwest campaigning for the Biden-Harris ticket. Whitmer has repeatedly tweeted support for the Biden-Harris ticket. The others, like Michelle Obama, are focused on their other project and whatever is going on in their lives. The situation is not much different if Biden decides to step down and the nomination is denied to his vice president, Kamala Harris.
One of the things you said, I saw this on Twitter, that if Biden were to step aside, it would have to be pretty much Harris, right, as the new nominee. Now, can you explain to me why you made that statement and what would be the mechanics of enforcing that?
It's not a mechanical thing, I think. There are a few reasons. First of all, in terms of the conscience clause, right? And there's nothing legalistic or mechanical about this. It's purely political. In terms, obviously people are voting for the Biden-Harris ticket. right? So in theory, if there has to be a change, it's the most reflective of the voters to say, okay, well, this was the ticket. Harris is the vice president. She was, second in command anyway. She would replace Biden if he were to resign the presidency. So that makes sense. That's just a political consideration. At a very real sort of how do you win an election consideration, it's by far the easiest play for Harris to be able. Harris can use the hard money that the Biden-Harris campaign has raised in a way no other candidate can. Some other candidate would have to have the money transferred to the coffers of the DNC, run a separate campaign, and there are many challenges with the DNC running the entire presidential campaign on behalf of someone. So from the fundraising standpoint and the money standpoint, Harris can most easily use it. Also, there are coalitional issues. I mean, frankly speaking, the party would be incredibly irresponsible and turning its back on, incredibly important parts of its base if it were to overlook and pass over the vice president, who is, a woman of, Black and Indian descent. It would be incredibly destructive to do that.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that was your reason for for saying that it would have to be Harris. Now, but that would still have to depend on Biden voluntarily taking himself out of the running, right? I mean, there's no scenario where Harris essentially leads a coup against her own president and demands that the pledged delegates vote for her instead.
Correct. All of these scenarios depend on Biden voluntarily surrendering the nomination in order to preserve his legacy and defeat Donald Trump.
Right.
Unless that happens, none of these scenarios play out.
In the extremely rare circumstance that both Biden and Harris decide they want to step down, the convention would be held with no presumptive nominee. This is called an open or brokered convention. The notion of an open convention received a lot of buzz back when Ezra Klein advocated it from his perch at the New York Times. I think it was in February. Here's what Atkins had to say about that.
I've seen a lot of people spinning scenarios about an open convention. As you said, that's a very chaotic process, and it's sort of. Can you explain to us how that would work? Why? What would trigger an open convention, and why do you think it would be a chaotic process?
Well, in theory, then you're basically. Let's assume a scenario that for whatever reason, neither Biden nor Harris were in a position to accept the nomination. Then you would have an extremely shortened timeline for a variety of candidates to attempt to persuade delegates in advance of the convention vote, which again is coming up very soon if we hold the vote virtually in late July, as the current plan is.
I see.
Then, you'd have a mad dash campaign with various individuals assuming that the party didn't all coalesce behind one person somehow. Then you would have that, and it's unlikely that one person would win a majority on the first ballot. Then you would go to second ballots. Whenever we held that vote, you'd lose an incredible amount of time, and you would also generate bruised feelings among various factions of the party. And the new campaign of whoever it was would essentially start from scratch with their own campaign in addition to whatever had been raised. I think there are legal concerns that people have brought up. Certainly the Heritage Foundation and others have threatened to sue if it's anyone but Biden on the ballot. I think those legal, obviously there are a number of conservative judges in the Supreme Court that are hostile to Democratic interests, and you can never be 100% sure what the judges will do at this point. That having been said, the DNC is a private institution,
Right.
Its own rules indicate that it has the ability to nominate whoever it so pleases, regardless of what happened on our own ballot. And our nominee can be our nominee. I don't think that there would be a problem with the nominee getting on the ballot. I mean, again, postulate a situation where for whatever reason, neither Biden nor Harris were able to accept the nomination. You would not see a situation where no Democratic nominee were able to appear on 50 state ballots. That would not happen. The nominee would appear on 50 state ballots. So I am not too worried about that. But yes, the process would be chaotic. It would be messy. It would be ugly, and it would lose us incredible amounts of time going up against Donald Trump that we simply can't afford to lose.
Right. And again, to be clear, this scenario of the open convention you're stating is in the situation where both Biden and Harris can't or decide to voluntarily remove themselves from contention.
And again, this would never happen. It would never happen. I'm just saying, like, postulate
theoretically. Yeah.
Theoretically. So, right. But realistically, it would be a terrible idea to hold an open convention, and Harris is the only realistic alternative.
Yeah, and to be clear, like you're saying any scenario of like some other Democrat holding some sort of coup against the Biden-Harris ticket is really just an insane scenario, and it's not likely to happen at all.
It's not going to happen. The individuals themselves are not going to do it. There's no good incentive to do it. I'm merely stating that, you know, if you postulate wildly unlikely situations, I'm just saying that the people who say, oh, there's no way no one else's name could ever appear on the ballot, none of that is true. If unthinkable things started to happen, we would have a nominee on 50 state ballots, and people who say otherwise are overstating the case. That having been said, realistically speaking, Harris is the only alternative that makes any sense and that is realistic in any way.
Understood. And one last question, since you brought it up. You mentioned the virtual vote, right?
Yes.
So is that virtual vote, which you said would be held towards the end of July, is that to replace the vote in August, or is that in addition to?
No, it replaces the vote in August, and that was because the Ohio Republicans were playing games, basically, and continue to threaten to play games around whether our nominee will be able to appear on the Ohio ballot due to the timing of the convention. So it was determined that we would hold a vote earlier in order to avoid that.
And when is that due? In July?
Late July at some point, yes.
I see.
Supposedly,
Okay.
But the Rules and Bylaws Committee has to affirm and make it real.
What that leaves us with, and for many this will come as a relief, are only two real possibilities. Either Biden decides to keep his bid alive and is nominated, or he chooses of his own accord to step down and throw his support to Harris. But according to Atkins, this eventuality, if it does occur, can be a very orderly process with no chaos or trickery.
I think it's important to note that if that does happen, it's not as chaotic as many people are saying it is. All that would need to happen. You know, there are many people who have Aaron Sorkin-esque fantasies about how cool an open convention would be. It would not. Yeah. It would be incredibly destructive. But the choices are not Biden and an incredibly destructive open convention. If Joe Biden were to surrender the nomination and say, I'm throwing all of my support to Vice President Harris, and I believe she would make a fantastic president, and I'm asking all of my delegates to support her on the first ballot, then, then there's your conscience pledge, right? I mean, whenever we hold the vote, all that would need to happen is literally Joe Biden says, I'm giving my vote. I'm asking I'm not running for president again. I'm pledging my support to Vice President Harris. I want all of my delegates to vote for Vice President Harris. Then all the delegates vote for Vice President Harris on the first ballot. And it's a done deal. Like, it's not complicated.
Okay. Actually, one final question. Jamie Harrison, who's the head of the DNC, has thrown his support behind Biden. And my question on that front is, does it matter? Because he doesn't get any extra vote beyond the delegates, as the head of the DNC. Does he control any mechanism or any vote where his opinion matters or counts? Am I making sense?
You are. This is a political question. As a pure mechanistic issue, the chair appoints 75 members to the DNC. But look, I don't think this is not going to be a situation where the DNC and the pledged delegates vote in defiance of Jamie Harrison. This is either a situation where the handwriting on the wall becomes obvious enough that Joe Biden voluntarily steps aside and cedes his delegates to Harris, or he doesn't. And if he doesn't, Joe Biden will be the nominee, and we will do our best to elect him. And if he does, then I expect it will be an orderly transition to Kamala Harris, and we will do our best to elect her.
So there you have it. In the din and buzz of the last 2 weeks of endless self-flagellation and uncertainty, I found it useful to keep my eye on the levers of control and the mechanism of nomination. Maybe it's my training as a coder. Biden is an independent actor, and he will either choose to run or step down. If he steps down, he will relinquish the nomination to Harris. That's it. Those are the breaks, and that's the score. The rest is sound and fury signifying nothing. This has been an episode of the Odd Post podcast, written, produced, and hosted by me, Anila Milchandani. Please share, please rate it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.